It kills all the birds.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to get into some pretty wild stuff today?
Always ready for a deep dive.
So, we're going to be going behind the scenes of the recent Israel-Hamas ceasefire and hostage deal.
Yeah.
And I think when you hear what went down, you're going to be pretty surprised by just how crazy this whole thing is.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating story, especially when you consider the broader context, the history of this conflict.
Totally. And get this. We're actually going to be talking about the possible involvement of Trump in all of this.
Oh, wow.
Even though he's not in office.
Right.
Yeah, so to help us unpack all of this, we've got some great articles that we're going to be referencing. So we've got the Times of Israel, we've got Politico, and we've got Newsweek.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they all kind of paint a pretty compelling picture of what happened here.
Yeah, and what makes this even more interesting is that this whole thing, went down with the backdrop of the Biden administration's, stalled negotiations. This conflict has been dragging on for over a year now.
Yeah.
And so, everyone's kind of looking to Biden to be the one to take charge and figure this whole thing out.
Right. And then Trump kind of comes out of nowhere.
Exactly.
It's like, wait a minute.
Yeah. It's like, where did he come from?
Yeah. What's going on here?
Well, we also have to remember the humanitarian crisis that was happening in Gaza,
Right.
which was getting worse and worse.
Of course.
So that definitely added, another layer of pressure
Right.
to find a solution to this whole thing and to find one fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't forget about Hezbollah. They secured their own ceasefire with Israel just a couple months ago.
That's true. That's a really crucial point, I think, because, that success that they had may have actually emboldened Hamas to push for a similar deal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you've got, this complex web of factors all coming together to create this, this urgent need for some kind of breakthrough.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where this guy, Steve Witkoff, comes in.
Okay.
Now, this guy is not your typical diplomat.
No.
Newsweek describes him as a real estate mogul. Longtime Trump associate. Basically the opposite of your typical buttoned-up ambassador.
Interesting. So he's described as a businessman who wants to reach a deal quickly and charges ahead unusually aggressively.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because it just completely contrasts with that traditional image that we all have in our heads of what a diplomat is,
Yeah.
Very careful.
Right. It's like sending a bull in a china shop.
Exactly.
But maybe that's exactly what they needed in this situation.
Yeah, maybe that's what you need to shake things up sometimes, right?
Right.
So what's interesting is that Politico actually has some details about how Witkoff interacted with Netanyahu and how he was very blunt with him, even when it came to something as sensitive as, the observance of the Sabbath.
Wow.
He reportedly said something along the lines of, the president-elect doesn't observe the Sabbath.
He just said that.
Yeah, to secure a meeting with him.
Wow. Talk about not mincing words.
I know, right?
He didn't let protocol get in the way.
No, he did not. And apparently, this no-nonsense approach worked.
Really?
Yeah. The Times of Israel quotes Arab officials as saying that Witkoff actually achieved more in one meeting with Netanyahu than the Biden administration did all year.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that is some serious power move.
It is.
So we've got, this humanitarian crisis. We've got Hezbollah's successful ceasefire. And then Trump decides, okay, I'm going to send in this unconventional envoy.
Right.
But it gets even more interesting because around the same time, Trump makes this public statement that if the hostages aren't back by his inauguration, all hell will break loose.
Wow.
So was this just tough talk, or was this a very calculated tactic?
That's a good question. It's certainly a statement that grabbed everyone's attention, right?
Yeah.
And on the surface, it might seem like a direct threat aimed at Hamas. But if we dig a little deeper, there are some interesting interpretations from people like Steve Bannon and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert.
Right.
And they suggest that the real target of Trump's statement might have actually been Netanyahu.
Hold on. So he's putting pressure on his ally, not the enemy.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating twist.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense when you think about all the political dynamics at play here, know?
Oh, cool.
Netanyahu may have been more worried about, upsetting Trump.
Right.
Especially because he was hoping to get Trump's support on other issues like Iran and the two-state solution.
Right. Which kind of puts Biden in a weird spot.
Exactly.
Because he's trying to navigate this really complicated situation.
Right.
But he's also got to think about, what's going on back home.
Of course. Especially after, losing the election.
Yeah, for sure.
So, the sources kind of hint that the Biden administration might have been a little hesitant to push Israel too hard.
Right.
Right.
Maybe because of those political calculations.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act.
It really is.
So we've got this almost Shakespearean drama playing out.
Yeah.
We've got a president-elect on the sidelines, wielding his influence.
Right.
We've got a non-diplomat envoy who's just shaking things up.
We've been so focused on how this whole thing came together.
Right.
But we haven't really talked about, the specifics of the agreement.
Right. What exactly does this ceasefire entail?
Yeah. What are the terms?
So according to the Times of Israel, it's a 3-phased plan.
Okay.
The first phase involves the release of 33 hostages.
Okay.
Women, children, the elderly, and those who are seriously ill.
Okay. And what does Israel get in return for that?
So in exchange for that initial release of hostages, Israel's going to release about 1,000 Palestinian security prisoners.
Okay.
And they're also going to partially withdraw from Gaza.
Okay, so that's phase 1.
Right.
What about the other 2 phases?
So the second phase, which won't even be negotiated until that first phase is underway,
Right.
will see the release of the remaining living hostages.
Got it.
And a declaration of a permanent ceasefire.
Okay.
And then finally, the third phase focuses on the release of bodies that are still being held by Hamas.
So it's a very step-by-step process.
Yeah.
Where each phase depends on the success of the one before it.
Exactly.
Sounds incredibly delicate.
It is.
But what's interesting is that this framework, it's basically the same one that Israel proposed back in May.
That's true.
Which, as we talked about, was initially rejected by Hamas.
Right.
So what changed?
Yeah. Why are they agreeing to it now?
I guess that's where all those factors we've been talking about come into play.
Right.
The humanitarian crisis getting worse.
Right.
Hezbollah's ceasefire being successful. And then, of course, the pressure from Trump.
Exactly.
All those things probably contributed to Hamas changing their minds.
It's likely a combination of all of those things.
Right.
And we can't forget about, the efforts of the mediators.
Oh, yeah.
Qatar and Egypt.
Of course.
Who've been working really hard behind the scenes to make these negotiations happen.
Their role has been crucial.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even, in these really complex geopolitical situations,
Right.
there are people who are working hard to promote dialogue and peace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got this very fragile ceasefire.
Right.
We've got a plan for releasing the hostages.
Yeah.
And there's hope for, some kind of lasting peace in the region.
It's like a first step.
It is.
Ah,
But knowing all of this, what can we really learn from this whole thing?
that's a great question.
What are the big takeaways?
I think one of the big things is that this whole situation, it really kind of challenges how we think about international diplomacy.
How so?
Well, we usually think of it as this very formal process,
Right.
slow moving.
Sure.
But this case shows us that individual personalities and relationships,
Yeah.
they can actually have a huge impact.
I mean, you're right. You can't ignore the fact that, Trump and Netanyahu,
Right.
they had this history together.
They go way back.
And it seems like that relationship really influenced how Netanyahu responded to Witkoff.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, would this deal have even happened if someone else had been sent as the envoy?
Right.
Someone who didn't have that personal connection with Netanyahu.
That's a good question.
It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
but it definitely makes you think about, the role of personal dynamics
Yeah.
in these really high-stakes negotiations.
Right. And then there's the whole thing with Trump being involved, even though he wasn't officially in office yet.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty unusual for a president-elect to be so involved.
That is, yeah.
Yeah. Very unprecedented.
In an international crisis like this.
It makes you wonder if this could set a precedent for future transitions of power.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Will we see more incoming presidents kind of, asserting themselves on the world stage before they're even sworn in?
And what would that mean for global stability?
Exactly. Could it lead to more uncertainty, more volatility?
These are some really big questions.
They are.
And I don't think there are any easy answers.
No. But one thing's for sure. This whole deep dive has definitely given me a new perspective
Me too.
on just how complicated international relations really are.
It reminds us that, things are rarely as straightforward as they might seem on the surface.
Yeah,
And that the actions of individuals can have these huge ripple effects
totally.
that we might not even be able to predict.
Well, we've got this fragile ceasefire in place.
Right.
We've got a roadmap for releasing the hostages.
Yeah,
And there's hope for a more lasting peace in the region.
there is.
But what do you think? What's your take on all of this?
Yeah. What do you think's going to happen next?
Do you think this deal's going to hold? What do you think this means for the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It's a complex situation, no easy answers.
Definitely not.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you some new things to think about,
Some food for thought.
some new perspectives to consider. So thanks for joining us on this journey,
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
and we'll see you on the next deep dive.